Have you ever opened your eyes in the morning, looked at the person sleeping beside you, and felt like you were lying next to a stranger? His face is still the same. You could trace the lines on his hands with your eyes closed. And yet, something is different. His gaze has become distant, as if a silent wall had formed between you. You remember how, once upon a time, that same look made your heart race. Now, it barely makes your breath move. Everything around you appears normal. The house is still intact, the dinner table still warm. Holidays are still celebrated. The children are busy with school. The bills still get paid. But somewhere beneath the routine, something has quietly shifted. A feeling you can't quite name starts to emerge, one that grows louder in the silence. And then one morning, the truth lands softly but firmly. I don't think I love him anymore. This realization doesn't erupt like an explosion. It seeps in like fog. It creeps into the spaces between conversations, between touches that once meant something. It's in the way good night has turned into a habit instead of a connection, in the way your name is no longer said with intention. You once blamed it on exhaustion. Now you wonder if it was a kind of waking. Psychologist Sigmund Freud once said, "What is repressed never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return." And for many women, that moment arrives not with drama, but with quiet clarity. The years of unspoken disappointment, unacknowledged feelings, swallowed words, they begin to stir. The first thing they reach for is not memory, it's presence. The presence of a man who used to feel like home, but now feels like a guest you didn't invite. You try to remember when it began. Was it the first time he chose his phone over your voice? Was it the weekend you cried alone in the kitchen? Was it after 1,000 little rejections that didn't even register as rejections? But the truth is, there wasn't a single moment. It was all of them. A series of tiny, unattended fires that together burned a quiet hole through the center of your affection. This is the silent crisis that so many women face, not because of betrayal, not because of cruelty, but because of fatigue, the kind that isn't visible on the surface, the kind that lives in the body, in the skin, in the breath, the kind that makes you look in the mirror and not recognize your own reflection because you've spent so long being everything to everyone that you forgot to be someone to yourself. You stay, but not because of love. You stay because of inertia, because of guilt, because you don't know what leaving would look like. You tell yourself, he hasn't done anything wrong. But deep down, you know that not doing wrong isn't the same as doing right. And what's more unsettling, you can't even explain what exactly has been lost. You just know the spark has long since turned to ash. The death of a marriage doesn't always come with shouting. Often, it arrives with silence, like a wall that rises slowly, brick by brick, until the two of you are no longer looking at each other, just through each other. You may still sleep in the same bed, but your hearts haven't touched in years. Freud said that love is not a fixed state. It is a continuous act of creation, and when you stop creating it, nurturing it, breathing life into it, it quietly stops living. You stop talking, not out of resentment, but because there's nothing left to say. You stop asking for more, not because you don't want more, but because you know you won't receive it. You laugh out of habit, not joy. You begin to drift, not out of anger, but out of emotional survival. This isn't abandonment, it's erosion. And what makes it so tragic is that no one did anything intentionally cruel. You just slowly stopped choosing each other. Or maybe he stopped choosing you, and you finally noticed. Perhaps you once imagined growing old together, sitting on a porch in your 70s, sipping tea, recounting the chaos of raising a family. But now, that vision feels hollow, because what's worse than loneliness is being lonely beside someone who doesn't see you anymore. This is not the death of a fairy tale. It's the arrival of truth. Love, despite our best hopes, is not eternal by default. It requires renewal. It thrives on attention. It breathes through presence. And when it's deprived of these, it doesn't scream. It simply withers, quietly, subtly, completely. So you start walking alone in the evenings. You lie awake at night staring at the ceiling. You don't know what you're searching for, but you know it's not in the room with you. And no, you're not heartless. You're not ungrateful. You're just finally seeing what you've been refusing to see for years. You've lost yourself. And now you want her back. Freud once said, "What is repressed always returns, not with a scream, but with a whisper. And often it's your own body that hears it first. It starts with something small, a wave of irritation when he tells the same joke again, a sigh when he doesn't notice your new haircut, a moment of numbness when he reaches for your hand and you instinctively pull away. You can't explain why. You just know it's not the same anymore. And slowly, something inside begins to speak, something that has been silent for years. You see, many women spend decades being everything for everyone. Mothers, wives, daughters, caretakers, employees. They hold the family together, hold back their tears, hold in their words, and somewhere along the way, they stop holding themselves. They tell themselves it's fine, that this is what life looks like, that love matures into duty, that passion becomes partnership, that silence means peace. But Freud warned us, silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's suppressed grief. This grief doesn't announce itself. It leaks through fatigue that sleep cannot fix, through anxiety that seems to have no cause, through the quiet avoidance of intimacy, and the slow but steady withdrawal of presence. The body begins to speak the truths the mouth never dared to say. You begin to notice how often you perform, the smile that doesn't reach your eyes, the dinner you cook even when no one says thank you, the conversations you initiate because no one else will, the small sacrifices you make every day that go unnoticed, and worse, unreciprocated. Freud understood this well. He called it psychic fatigue, the exhaustion that comes not from what you do, but from who you have to be, the endless effort of maintaining harmony, the constant swallowing of needs just to keep the structure of the home intact, the accumulated weight of choosing peace over truth again and again. And here's the paradox. From the outside, everything still looks fine. You're still together. There's no yelling, no scandal, no visible cracks. But inside, something essential has withered. And what's most terrifying is that you can't point to a reason, because this isn't about what happened. It's about everything that never did. He didn't hit you. He didn't cheat. He didn't leave. But he also didn't see you, didn't ask, didn't grow, didn't notice the way your laughter faded, didn't hear the way your words grew fewer, didn't realize the way your touch stopped meaning, "I love you," and started meaning, "I'm trying." You've tried too. You've suggested date nights, brought up hard conversations, proposed vacations, bought new clothes, but every attempt felt like a dance you performed alone. Over time, you stopped trying, not because you gave up on the marriage, but because you gave up on being the only one trying to fix it. What makes this even harder is the guilt, because you do remember the good moments. You remember how he used to make you laugh, how you built a home together, raised children, survived hard years, and now the realization that none of it was enough to keep the connection alive feels like betrayal, not of him, but of the life you once dreamed of. But Freud would remind you, this is not betrayal. It's awakening. It's not ungratefulness. It's the return of the repressed. You're not rejecting your partner out of cruelty. You're rejecting the version of yourself that kept disappearing to keep the peace. You're not turning cold. You're thawing out the frozen parts of you that you've ignored for far too long. This awakening doesn't come with clarity. It comes with questions. Why does his voice irritate me now? Why do I feel invisible when he's sitting right beside me? Why do I dread the sound of his key in the door? Why does my body tense up when he touches me? You may not have words for it yet, but your body does. It remembers every moment you were expected to give without receiving, to carry without collapsing, to love without being loved in return. Desire dies in repetition. Passion dies in predictability. Love doesn't die with time. It dies in the absence of renewal. And when a relationship no longer offers growth, spontaneity, or curiosity, it becomes a museum of old feelings, dusty, well-preserved, but lifeless. Many women don't want someone new. They just want to feel alive again, to be seen, to be heard, to be touched with intention, not out of routine, but out of recognition. And when they can't find that within the marriage, they start to look elsewhere, not necessarily for another person, but for themselves. The version of them that used to dream, feel, create, move. The version that once felt like more than someone's wife. This is why the body becomes resistant, why she pulls away from his embrace, why intimacy feels forced, why even a kiss can feel like an invasion. It's not rejection, it's self-protection. And sometimes, even the kindest husband doesn't understand, because he sees himself as present, but emotional presence is not the same as physical presence. Being there isn't enough. What matters is how you're there. Is your attention with her? Are your eyes still curious? Is your touch still listening? Over the years, she's learned to expect less. Fewer compliments, shorter conversations, empty gestures. And one day, without planning it, she realizes she stopped expecting anything at all. Freud believed that healing begins when the unconscious becomes conscious, when what we've buried is brought to light, when the silence we've endured is finally spoken. And that's where many women find themselves, in the terrifying, liberating space of finally facing the truth they've been trying not to name. I'm not happy. It's not about infidelity, not about midlife crisis. It's about emotional starvation, about being surrounded by people, yet feeling unseen, about loving deeply and receiving routine, about waking up one day and realizing that the only thing holding the relationship together is the fear of what happens if you leave. But fear is not a foundation, and silence is not a solution. So she begins to pull back, not out of punishment, but preservation. She smiles less, speaks less, shares less, until one day, the distance is no longer something she feels, it's something she is. One of the most unsettling truths Freud ever taught us is this: we do not see others as they are, we see them as they are structured within us. This is the beginning of projection. When a woman begins to feel emotionally estranged from her partner, it is not always because of what he says or does. Sometimes it's about what he represents, in her inner world, in her symbolic architecture. Over time, especially in long-term relationships, the husband stops being a partner in her eyes. He slowly transforms, not into another man, but into a figure from her past. A father, not the literal father, but a symbolic one, the figure of authority, of judgment, of expectation. This transformation doesn't happen consciously. It builds over years, and moments when he critiques instead of listening, when he expects instead of asking, when he sits in silence while she serves the family dinner, and she flashes back to being a girl, clearing dishes while her father watched TV. In those micro moments, she begins to confuse roles, not rationally, but emotionally. He becomes a mirror of old hierarchies, and her body responds. Suddenly, touch becomes stiff. Intimacy feels forced. She prefers to sleep with her back to him. She flinches when he reaches for her, and she doesn't know why. But the reason lives deep in the psyche. Desire cannot flourish where authority lives. You do not desire someone who feels like a parent. You do not crave someone who symbolizes pressure. You do not open up erotically to the person who embodies control, even if that control is passive or unconscious. Many women don't realize this shift has happened. They simply start avoiding physical contact. They say things like, "I don't know why, I just don't want to be touched. It's nothing he did, I just feel shut down." It's not even about sex, it's about space. What they're really saying is, I no longer see him as my equal. And without equality, desire withers. Freud explored this dynamic in his theory of the Oedipus complex, not to pathologize women, but to understand how unresolved early experiences leak into adult relationships. If a woman grew up with a critical or emotionally distant father, she may unconsciously seek approval from similar male figures in adulthood. She may marry someone kind, stable, reliable. But over time, if her own voice remains unexpressed, if her needs go unspoken, if her life begins to orbit around service and sacrifice, she starts to reenact that same dynamic, seeking approval, shrinking herself, maintaining harmony. Eventually, she grows tired, not of her husband, but of the invisible script she's been performing all along. She wants to feel like a woman again, not a daughter. This is when distance sets in, not as rebellion, but as rescue. The avoidance of touch is not rejection. It's a plea for autonomy. Her body begins to protect itself from what it unconsciously associates with the past. She's not just pushing away a man. She's pushing away a role she never chose to play. Even in marriages where the husband is not explicitly controlling, this symbolic projection can occur. Sometimes it takes just one sentence. "You're always so emotional." You're exaggerating. You worry too much. Each of these phrases, repeated over years, reinforces the perception that her emotions are invalid, her perceptions flawed. And what does a child do when a parent constantly diminishes her feelings? She stops expressing them. The adult woman does the same. She grows quiet. She endures. She distances. And he, unaware of what's happening, assumes everything is fine. But it's not. Because she's no longer responding to him. She's responding to the father figure he has become in her unconscious mind. This is not blame. This is pattern. The tragedy is that most men do not recognize the symbolic weight they carry. They were never taught to navigate emotional intimacy. They were raised to be providers, not partners. Silent, not sensitive. Strong, not soft. And so, when their wife begins to withdraw, they feel confused. They say, "But I'm here. I haven't changed." And that's exactly the problem. She has changed, and he hasn't. She now craves depth over comfort, dialogue over duty, curiosity over routine. She no longer wants to be touched out of obligation. She wants to be seen, heard, known, not as a mother, not as a housekeeper, not as a long-term investment, but as a whole, breathing person. When that space is not offered, the body responds. Desire dries up, not because she is broken, but because her inner compass is pointing her toward wholeness. And what once felt like safety now feels like suffocation. This is why so many women in midlife begin to feel inexplicably cold. They are not punishing anyone. They are defending themselves from being erased. Sometimes the man tries to fix it. He suggests a vacation. He brings flowers. He says, "Let's rekindle the spark." But it's no longer about romance. It's about recognition. And recognition cannot be bought. It must be given, freely, consciously, daily. Freud believed that desire depends on symbolic space, that for intimacy to remain alive, partners must continue to see each other as separate beings, not fused into domestic roles. When a woman feels like her entire identity is reduced to wife or caretaker, desire exits. Because you cannot desire what is expected. You desire what surprises you, what sees you anew. In relationships where this recognition is absent, many women eventually shut down. They no longer initiate. They stop dressing up. They avoid eye contact. They reduce conversation to logistics. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling in a space that does not welcome it becomes unbearable. This, Freud argued, is not a flaw of character. It's a symptom of repression. The woman who no longer wants to touch her husband may not understand why, but somewhere deep inside, her soul is saying, "I cannot keep living in a role that kills my aliveness." And that perhaps is the most painful truth of all. She does not reject him. She rejects the script he unknowingly represents. This is not a failure of love. It is a failure of evolution. A failure to grow together. A failure to remain curious about the other. To update the map. To ask, "Who are you now?" instead of assuming she remains who she was 20 years ago. When she begins to pull away, it is not to hurt him. It is to save herself. To reclaim the pieces she lost while playing the roles society handed her. To become someone new, or someone she once was, before life folded her into silence. And in that space, if he cannot meet her, not as her father, her judge, or her dependent, but as her equal, then the marriage begins to rot from within, not dramatically, but silently. From one unspoken moment to the next, the end doesn't come with slammed doors or dramatic ultimatums. It doesn't explode. It dissolves, quietly, invisibly, like steam slipping through a crack in the window. She doesn't scream. She doesn't accuse. She simply stops trying. The woman who once asked, pleaded, compromised, adjusted, and forgave, now folds into silence, not out of spite, but out of depletion. Her emotional well has run dry, and she no longer sees the point in dipping her bucket into something that no longer quenches her. What she feels is not rage. It's not hatred. It's something far heavier, psychic exhaustion. She's tired of explaining herself to someone who doesn't truly listen, tired of maintaining a connection that only she nurtures, tired of carrying a relationship where intimacy is a routine and conversation is reduced to schedules and surface talk, tired of having a man beside her who occupies space, but not her soul. So, one day, she stops performing. She no longer cooks with care. She no longer smiles by default. She no longer initiates conversation or sex. She no longer waits to be noticed. What dies here is not just a marriage, it's an identity. The identity of the good wife, the one who endured, held it all together, forgave quietly, gave constantly, and asked for little. Freud taught us that when the ego surrenders itself too completely to the superego, the voice of duty, of rules, of moral expectations, the individual becomes ill, not necessarily with physical symptoms, but with soul fatigue, the kind of slow, untraceable sadness that accumulates when a person has spent too long being everything to everyone except themselves. And so, the woman who walks away, emotionally or physically, is not breaking a vow. She's breaking a pattern. She's not abandoning her partner. She is retrieving herself. She realizes, with a kind of mournful clarity, that the version of her who stayed for so long was driven more by guilt than love, more by the idea of what marriage should be than by what she actually experienced. She loved him, yes, but she also silenced herself for him, and now she knows. Love without self is not love. It is sacrifice dressed up in duty. When a woman hits this point, she's not looking for a new man. She's looking for a new mirror, one that reflects who she truly is, not who she was trained to be. And if she cannot find that mirror in her partner's eyes, she begins to build it herself, shard by shard, memory by memory. This is not cruelty. This is survival. She starts walking more, journaling, crying, yes, but also remembering the girl she was before life swallowed her whole, the one who used to sing out loud, dance barefoot, laugh too much, the one who had desires that weren't censored by motherhood, marriage, or modesty. And for the first time in years, she gives herself permission not to be responsible for anyone else's comfort. Many women at this stage feel immense guilt. How can I feel this way after all these years? Why now, after the children are grown and the storm has passed? But the truth is, now is the only time she finally has enough silence to hear herself think. Freud once said, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. And that is what she is doing now. Not destroying her marriage, but finally being honest about what she feels within it. And what she feels is absence, not physical, but emotional. She no longer wants to talk to friends about how distant he is. She no longer wants to explain why she's not in the mood. She no longer wants to pretend, because she knows, deep down, she's already left. He may still sit beside her, sleep next to her, talk to her about the weather, but in her heart she has packed her bags, not for another house, but for another self. She might stay. Some do. They remain in the marriage, but change everything within it. New boundaries, new expectations, a new voice. Others walk away entirely, not to rebel, not to hurt, but because they cannot continue living inside a role that has silenced their becoming. And that is where the paradox lies. The end of the marriage is not the end of her capacity to love. It is the beginning of her capacity to love herself, to wake up and not dread the day, to take up space without apology, to stop whispering her needs like confessions, to finally realize that choosing herself is not selfish, it is sacred. Some people won't understand. They'll ask, how could you leave such a stable relationship? What more did you want? But stability without intimacy is just endurance. And no one wants to endure the rest of their life. They want to live it. And so, the woman leaves the version of her who stayed small, who lowered her voice, who made herself smaller just to fit inside the room called marriage. She doesn't hate him. She doesn't even blame him. She just can't do this anymore. And if he asks why, she might not have a clear answer. She might simply say, I've changed. And that would be the most honest thing she's said in years. Freud never promised happiness. He offered clarity. And that clarity often hurts. But in that pain, something new begins. A woman no longer living to be loved, but living because she loves herself enough to start again.